Welcome to this Skillick Explains video. This week I'm going to release the result of another poll I ran recently, this time on the subject of how people plan to pay for their eventual retirement. I gave some options and I'd like to just run through the results. So when it comes to paying for our eventual retirement, our life after work as I like to call it, 6.2% of people who responded said they'd rely on the state. Not many people. Now the state do offer a basic and a full state pension, and that in some cases can be topped up various ways, but the bottom line is I think a lot of people are correctly nervous about relying too heavily on the state alone to fund them once they stop work, and there are several reasons for that. First of all, the state pension may or may not exist in its current form when younger people in particular get all the way through to the point where they stop work. As we all live longer, as we all potentially work a bit longer, who knows what form the state pension will take. Secondly, the amount is not enough for most people in terms of their ambitions, in terms of wanting to travel, spend time doing activities perhaps they didn't do when they were at work. So although it can provide a foundation, for most people the state pension alone would not be something they'd solely lean on as their source of retirement income. And then there's the fact that it doesn't kick in until well into your 60s now, and the minimum age is rising all the time. So I think for a lot of people with ambitions to perhaps at least partly wind down work before then, the state pension doesn't look like a particularly good bet by itself. Next up was property. 7.4% of people said they might choose to rely on property and rental income from property. Now, whilst there are landlords out there who will disagree with me and who make a good living from renting out property in one way, shape or form, I do sympathise with some people who are thinking I don't necessarily regard that as the perfect vehicle to fund my life after work. Why not? Well, first of all, property is an expensive asset to both set up and maintain. The upfront costs are considerable. Yes, the occasional stamp duty holiday can help, but once you're talking about a property which is not your principal private residence or main home, the costs even on that front start to escalate sharply. And meanwhile, government reforms have made it more and more of a squeeze to get a decent net yield out of property assets. They're quite complicated to run. An investment portfolio by comparison is relatively straightforward. You run the risk with property of void periods, repairs, stroppy tenants and so on, not to mention keeping pace with all the rules that surround the regulation of properties that are rented out professionally. Property is a fairly illiquid asset. If it comes to the point where you need to draw from it, yes, there are ways of doing that, but some of them are relatively expensive. And selling a property is time consuming, albeit that may be a way to raise some capital, but watch out for capital gains tax on second properties in particular. And then there's the fact that a lot of people, once they stop work and get a little bit older, may not want to spend their time trying to maintain an asset such as property. Next up, 17.3% of people thought they'd be relying in some way, shape or form on an employer final salary pension. That could be the state, or it could be one of the few companies still offering that style of pension. Now these are great if you happen to be a member of such a scheme. They're called defined benefit or final salary in a lot of cases, and these are pensions where the amount you get is linked to the amount that you retired on. It's a proportion of that final salary. Could be 2/3, could be a half, it varies now. And indeed, whether it's linked to your final salary or an average of your working life can vary too. But I think the reason a lot of people are not going to rely on that as a source of retirement income is, to put it simply, they've not been offered that style of scheme by a current employer and they don't see themselves being offered one in the future. So final salary, defined benefit pensions, great if you happen to be in one, and I'd think very carefully about any offer to transfer out of it. That needs to be considered with due care, but for most people that's probably not the main source of their retirement income. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Nearly 70% of people who entered my poll said they'd be relying on their own investments via some kind of drawdown route potentially. So most people are going to be forced to save within tax efficient shelters. Individual savings accounts are one way of doing it, self-invested personal pensions are another, but the bottom line is at some point they're going to need to withdraw those assets and manage them or have them managed for them so that they have some kind of income stream during the period of their lives where they're no longer bringing in a salary as such, or employment or earnings from self-employment. Now I want to finish with a few closing thoughts therefore. Number one, I think a lot of people are thinking like me, do I really want to retire at what could be regarded as a conventional retirement age? Perhaps I prefer to carry on working, perhaps I need to carry on working, albeit possibly not on a 5 days a week basis. So I think the idea of a traditional retirement, if you're really lucky aged 55 or 60 or 65, is slowly slipping out of the picture for a lot of people. Secondly, although I've put these options down, the state pension, property and employer's pension and running your own investment drawdown program as separate options, the reality is some people will take what I call a portfolio approach. They may choose to actually access some income from a mixture of those different sources, provided they're in a position to do so. The other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind is that by answering I'm going to do it for my own investments when it comes to stopping work, that's how I see my future being funded. By saying that, essentially people are putting more responsibility on their own shoulders for making sure they get the balance right as they draw down from these investment portfolios. They don't go too fast and run the risk of running out of money, but equally they don't go too slowly and then actually don't feel the full benefit of all this money they've worked hard to accumulate. So there is a balance to be struck there. And the state is fairly or unfairly, some would say the latter, putting the onus very much on you to manage that process successfully. Now pensions are a big topic area, so if you'd like to watch other videos on all the pension basics, then please do go to our fairly comprehensive educational library at killick.com/learn. And the tax efficient savings and investment principles tabs are not a bad place to start. I've also got a couple of guides on this area, so do email me, editor@killick.com, to receive them. One is about building up assets towards that point where you stop work, and the other is about generating income from a mix of different assets once you need to draw on them because you're no longer receiving a salary or you no longer have self-employed earnings, for example. So there we have it. A big topic, a couple of places you can go for further information at the end there, and plenty of food for thought for all of us.